Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Cool. So this is kind of a follow-up to the previous one of what do you do past the concerns of a single message. In the early parts of Addison's slides, for instance, he was talking a lot about resource files and how these go to localizers, translators, and how all of this works. And we've not solved all the problems yet with MessageFormat 2. This is me talking about some of the things we can and ought to be looking at next. So, hi, I'm Eemeli. I've been working on localization stuff for like a while now, mostly in the JavaScript space. Most originally it was mostly under the OpenJS Foundation, and nowadays also, or primarily actually, at Mozilla. And one part of this work has been part of the MessageFormat working group, but also a few other projects. So effectively, what I'm pitching here is that we need a new file format for localizable messages. Yes, MessageFormat 2 messages can be embedded effectively anywhere where you have localizable messages these days, but that there are some concerns that we've identified throughout this work that ought to be solved better by a resource format. One of them is that the messages, in particular the multivariant messages that MessageFormat 2 allows, or messages that include declarations, very naturally end up being multi-line. So they're much easier to read if the content that you're looking at supports a string that is a multi-line string. And this is not as well supported in current resource formats as it could be. Another aspect is that we have very often very significant comments and metadata about a message that is important for the translation work, but is completely irrelevant when you're actually in the formatting runtime. And the representation of this is not as good as it could be in all the places. And then furthermore, if we're talking about metadata, we need to understand what that metadata is. And so that whoever is declaring the metadata about a message is talking in a language that the recipient or the reader or the systems that the translators are using can also understand. And finally, there's the issue that a MessageFormat 2 message is a single message. And many of the messages we need to deal with in the real world end up being either concatenations or on compound messages of various sorts that have multiple localizable parts. So how do we deal with all of this? How do we combine messages? And it would be really nice for us to be able to declare effectively the MessageFormat 2 work to be done after we actually get it published. But we have these issues that we really ought to have better solutions for. About multi-line values, as I mentioned. I'm going to go through some of the examples of not all, but some of the formats that are used for localizable messages for various aspects of this. For example, multi-line values most often require some sort of escaping or some sort of marking for the new line character to show up within the body of a message or otherwise. And then how do you actually combine a value so it flows naturally? And so when you're actually looking at the resource, that it looks like a multi-line value. This is problematic in most places. XLIF and other XML formats are somewhat good about this, but they're to the leading white space, and all white space ends up being significant. And that's problematic a bit. And then when we're talking about general purpose containers, some like JSON in particular say that you're not allowed to have any comments of any sort. Everything that's in there must be data of one sort or another. And then at the other end of this is YAML, where it's got too many string formats. And I say this as one of the authors of the current YAML specification, in that for localization purposes, YAML has too many options to play around with. And that's a little bit of an issue with other general purpose or generic formats as well. Then there's the issue of comments and metadata. So this is something that some of the localization specific formats like Gettext, .pl files and xlif get right effectively, in that you are able to assign information about a message to a specific message. Whereas in most formats, comments are explicitly left out. I'm quoting there from the YAML spec that comments must not have any effect on the serialization tree or representation graph of a YAML document. Effectively, there's, in many cases, specifications say that you're not allowed to look, when you're representing programmatically the contents of a document, into the comments. And even in the places where you are, it is relatively rare that there's a defined attachment of a comment to some specific entry or part of a resource, like a section or otherwise. And this doesn't prohibit us from using, say, comments in .properties files or otherwise from being considered in many cases as important for localizers. But when you actually look at the spec or what is the definition of the .properties format, this is not there. There is no definition for how this works. This is something of a problem when you're looking at providing a proper standard specified solution for localizable resources. Then there's the, if you've got metadata, what's in the metadata? Where, again, specific formats for localization, like Gettext and xlif in particular, sort of get this right. With Gettext, you can have various sorts of comments attached to a message, and these have a couple of different classes. And with xlif too, there's a plethora of different ways in which you can communicate information about a message or parts thereof to a translator. But xlif has its own issues as a resource format, purely as a source resource format, that I'll get to a little bit later. And then there's the issue of dealing with message references and compound messages. What do you do when you do have a list of things that you want to format, and the entities of that list, each of them is localizable, and you need to combine these somehow, and then use that whole list in another message? The bone dragon problem that Addison presented included some of this. So how do you do this combination? Can you do it within message format? And how do you refer to other messages? And then there's the compound messages, like an HTML element that contains some text, and it might contain a localizable title as well, where these messages are very tightly bound to each other, but they are two different patterns that are not well represented in a message format to message. There's ways of getting around it, provided that, for example, your placeholder does not have multiple variants that you need to concern yourself with. And there's other parts of how it can work. But again, this is a little bit solved in a couple of places. xlif has subflows as a concept where you can do these sorts of references of having a message within another message. And Fluent in particular has a whole plethora of solutions around this, where a single message can have a value and multiple different attributes that you can kind of combine into a single localizable element. And then you can have references to other messages and terms as well. But fundamentally, the case I would make here is that none of the existing formats really solves all the problems that we have really quite that well. So looking at some of the specific ones here, The first one is honestly Gettext, because as a localization resource format, Gettext is probably the best one out there right now, in that it supports most of the information that is actually relevant for translators, and it is decently usable as a pure text file if you need to edit it as a developer otherwise. But it does have, of course, issues, like the set of the metadata fields is not really extensible. The colon, comma, space characters that follow a hash, that set of honestly somewhat arcane indicators is not very user-friendly, shall we say. And it has its own built-in support for plural variants that are index-based, and this does not match what we're doing with MessageFormat 2. That's not to say that MessageFormat 2 isn't likely to be available actually in Gettext at some point. I've had some conversations with some of the Gettext GNU Gettext developers at the moment. So the adoption of MessageFormat 2 is likely to be wide, but Gettext is unlikely to provide all of the solutions we really want. And furthermore, there's the issue that representing multi-line values in Gettext requires you to escape the literal new line that you have in the value. And in order to make it feel right, you need to do concatenation of quoted strings, and there's a lot of visual noise when you're looking at a Gettext file for a multi-line value, for instance. Xlib is another format that does a lot right, but it is fundamentally not really designed to act as the source format when you're acting as a developer or programmer. It is absolutely a common target for localization, and that's kind of the issue here, in that it is focused on that job that it does quite well. In fact, one of the further work parts of MessageFormat 2 that we've not solved yet, but do have identified for ourselves since years ago, honestly, is that we ought to have a standard mapping between MessageFormat 2 and Xlib 2. We have not settled on that yet because we've wanted to get some parts of the spec quite far. And Xlib 2 on this front does have this issue where it does not have a built-in support for message variants, which is somewhat challenging here, given how Xlib is used. Now, there's formats that are more general purpose, like dot properties, that are often used for translation, for localization content as the source format, and it works decently well. But there's no support for metadata in dot properties. There's, as I mentioned, there's no specification for how comments attach to key value pairs in dot properties. And there too, the multi-line values are not particularly friendly. And one particular concern here is that with dot properties, unlike with Gettext and Xlib to some extent, you can't say that this message contains syntax that's using MessageFormat 2 or ICU message format or anything. You need to externally provide that data. There's no way in the resource format itself to indicate this. Then we also, hands up here if you know about ICU resource bundle file syntax. That's 2 people, 3. So this is effectively the closest precursor to what I'm proposing we ought to be defining as message resources, which is an existing format defined roughly around the same time as ICU message format was for defining localizable resource bundle. But it hasn't been updated much since. And it has some of the same issues in that it doesn't support metadata or attach comments to values in any way. It's not really friendly for multi-line values. And it's another format that really likes its curly braces. And we might have used up the quota for curly braces with the MessageFormat 2 syntax. So I mean, sorry, I don't have a syntax example, but in order to have a MessageFormat 2 message in an ICU resource bundle, you would need to have double quotes and curly braces around the message, every single message, in order to make it work. It can work, but it's suboptimal, shall we say. And there's a whole bunch of other features which would be really nice to have, or maybe even considered to be required for a modern, performant message resource format and syntax. One is that it ought to be quite fast to parse.
Not on that list is developers want to write it.
And as Addison mentioned, another format aspect should be that developers want to write it. But we ought to, in addition to parsing fast, we should be able to fail fast and fail partially. So if we have a mistake in a file, because we do know that localization messages don't always come back in quite the shape we would like. So the format ought to be robust in that if a single message has bad syntax and we still want to format something, that the whole resource doesn't need to be tossed, but we can limit it.
One comment is that these are not necessary for all formats. Like fast to parse doesn't matter if you compile the thing in a binary form. Android does that, Windows does that, Macintosh. So a lot of systems don't consume raw files anymore. So it doesn't matter how long it takes to build, for example.
Some of these aspects.
I was going to save this until you finished, but since we brought up the issue of what developers need, we've been working on these things since, what, the 60s? And this is a classic example. I'm not directing this at you, but for the industry, it's a classic example of engineers collecting a list of problems and saying, I'm a better engineer, I can fix the problems and engineer another solution. And we go from these engineer-oriented solutions, but it doesn't address who should be authoring messages. How does the developer support them? How does the translator get access to them? What are those roles? And also, how should the message be styled? And we don't look at the user's requirements and work from there, as well as scoping how much of this should we be, how much of this should we actually be, what type of messages do we dealing with? Are we just talking about getting a string formatted, or do you want to be able to format a page and understand how the text fits into a context of something larger? So, I would like to see those roles scoped. The architecture of the messages, the author of the messages, and that may be different than the developer, and then what the developer needs to accomplish, what a translator needs and does, and so forth. So, and the stylist, so something like separating out CSS, because what some strings need, bolding versus some other way of accomplishing stress. All of those things need to be factored in instead of looking at the engineering issues of how do I take a piece of something here and another piece of something here and get it up on the screen. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think
yeah, and one more thing, you might look at DITA, because that's also a format that if you architect your text in a certain way, you can pick and choose contents and bring them together. It's an XML standard. Yeah, I'm taking it.
so. I agree. I'm not here to present a solution. I'm here effectively presenting a problem and pointing at these are aspects that within the MessageFormat 2 work we've identified ought to be solved. And I agree with the further issues that you're pointing at. I hope and expect that some of that work, some of those issues we can solve already with the MessageFormat 2 spec and what's in there and what is possible there. But that is not going to cover all of what you mentioned. But to go on from there and to make sure that the concerns of different user groups, different workflows around messages, and the whole lifetime behavior of how do you work with messages, and how do you format them, and how do you evolve them, can be accounted for. This is why I'm saying we ought to be providing a better solution overall for this. And I don't think the existing solutions are good enough for what we want.
I think maybe the add-on, and I'll let you get back to your presentation, but it's we hived off this higher level thing from MessageFormat to not that early, but relatively early in its gestation. And that was intentional to focus the problem on individual messages. But we still have an industry-wide problem of there are 5 billion resource formats and none of them are well provisioned and solve the problem. And they're not, the knowledge of writing and managing and all that is not portable in any way. And so it would be helpful if we could coalesce around formats that could feed a successful localization process, that capture the right data and so on, and can be made portable between different frameworks and platforms and so on. So I think that's kind of where the proposal is going, and the illustration is people have seen portions of the problem, and I've got an elephant ear and you've got a leg, and pretty soon we're, but we haven't solved the problem, and therefore the localization process remains mired in garbage up the strings into some XLIF dialect and pray that when we reassemble the result that it works.
One of the parts of the work that we've done within the MessageFormat 2 working group that I don't think Addison highlighted much, it's part of the last bullet point on this slide, which is that we've somewhere between intentionally and unintentionally put together a data model for messages that is, as far as we know, valid and decent for all existing formats. And one part of the work with the going further from there to cover message resources is that we ought to identify a data model that is valid for representing all resources of localizable messages, so that something like all of the existing resource syntaxes could be represented with the same data model structure, so that tooling could be built on top of that, and it can become much easier to not necessarily need to adapt the new things wholesale, but just partially in your stack where it feels appropriate, and make it easier to transform messages from one representation to another. So what I've got now after this is a straw man proposal. And explicitly, I'm not saying that this is what we ought to be doing. This is just an approximation of a resource syntax, and it does have an accompanying data model that, as far as we've in this preliminary work been able to identify, seems to work and seems to work decently well. But we're not claiming that we know how exactly do you work with this thing, if there are aspects that we're not taking as well into account or otherwise. So a rough description is that we use TOML as a structural basis. That's a .ini type of a file format where you can have like top level sections identified by square brackets, and then values are key equals value. But unlike TOML, all of the values are effectively MessageFormat 2 syntax directly, and can be multi-line just by indenting each of the value lines. And in order to get around this, we strip the leading white space on every line. I've not mentioned escapes, but this would mean that we would need to have something like a backslash space as a leading white space indicator when you do end up very occasionally in the situations where you need to have leading white space on a line. But the intent here would be to, with this resource format at least, to minimize the amount of escaping you would need to do for an actual message. And furthermore, the idea would be to separately define comment lines and metadata value lines that then explicitly attach always to the next section header, and from there to the section, or to the next entry, key value entry. And then in order to be able to target metadata and comments to cover the whole resource, we would use a -- style front matter separator to be kind of the next thing for the section level content at the very top of it. So it kind of looks like this, but I've taken some examples from our code at Mozilla to show real-ish examples here. But hopefully, as we do have some folks involved in the message format work who are going to improve the editor experience and provide a language server for tools like VS Code, Vim, Emacs, and other editors to highlight and identify errors. So we would have metadata like the locale of a resource, and then key equals value, like this multi-line content would kind of flow naturally, decently well. And we would allow for properties or tags on entries and otherwise. The character there is intentionally meant to be the same as what's generally used in JavaDoc and JSDoc and many other similar type or other documentation tooling, in order to make it hopefully as naturally readable to a developer or anyone else who needs to directly work with the raw text format, so that they can understand kind of what's going on better than any of the alternatives that we've got.
So
go ahead.
So my assumption is that multi-line messages behave like HTML, right? The new line is converted to a space, and they get in the previous message. Because that is extremely unfriendly for languages that don't use spaces, like Chinese, Japanese, Thai, right? Because I'm going to be forced to use a super long string, or I'm going to get random spaces in my message, which is bad.
So the straw man proposal here is that we would strip leading white space from every line.
Yeah, I'm talking about new line. After private here, there's a new line.
There is a new line there, yes.
It becomes a space?
It becomes a new line.
It becomes a new line.
Well, yes.
So if I don't want to break that, I want to generate something that it's a long paragraph with no new lines.
Then we would allow for backslash escaping the new line, as it happens in dot properties, for instance, so that you can have a continuation line going on from there. This is by no means the only possibility here, but it's a possibility that would solve that issue that you're describing, for instance.
I understand the desire to use the @ sign because of the way it's being used within this environment, but a lot of texts these days use @ signs because you're representing people's Instagram or other identities, as well as in emails. So that would mean that has to be escaped in the course of normal text. And it might be better actually to choose a different character that isn't going to frequently interfere with actual text usage. It's just a thought.
Thank you for the note. In this particular case, the way that again, strawman proposal for the syntax, it considers content to always either be following a key and an equal sign, or be on an indented line. So any content that is at the start of a line, like the @ sign here, is a syntax character, effectively. It's in different space But again, this is just a straw man. This is not meant to be final. This is just something that could work for the concerns that we have identified. But I'm not claiming at all that we've identified all the issues here. And we would like to identify those. And that kind of, sorry. One more thing that I was going to mention is that some of this work is also about identifying what are the specific metadata fields that we want to include and possibly how these are handled. One interesting question is whether to include something like a locale identifier as a requirement at the resource level. So every single resource would start with something like a locale included in the front matter, so that when you're looking at this resource, you do not need any additional data to find out what is the content, locale of the content meant to be in. Gettext and Xlif support something similar like this, but for example, .properties does not. And then there's a whole set of translator-specific issues for entries and other
Let's let Emil get through his presentation and then we'll ask questions.
So the final question that I kind of was leading up to here is that I think there are issues here that ought to be solved. And I would like to be finding solutions for these. And right now, the repository for this is in my personal GitHub space, which is not the right place for us standard to continue living in. And this is why I would like really for this work to be done here at Unicode, probably under the CLDR, like the MessageFormat 2 work has been done. But it's also entirely arguable that it should be done in IETF as a new media type definition, or as a new TC of ECMA, or under W3C like CSS is done, and so on. So this is why I'm here, because I think there are aspects of this that connect both translators, authors, editors, stylists, and developers that all ought to be accounted for. And the best forum for this is here at Unicode.
I have the mic.
Questions?
Ask a question.
I think Abosh has a question.
Oh, go ahead.
So I think I agree that you already mentioned that Xlif is kind of close to it, and it is a standard. So maybe for most of the platforms, that would be the way to go. For JavaScript, I agree that it's probably like, I'm going to use balkanized for resource handling. And JSON is definitely not the way to go, as it's missing comments. So maybe focus more on the web platform for this. As I don't see, maybe I'm wrong, Android removing their support for the current resource format and replacing it with the new one. I'm not sure about iOS or other platforms. Like, so that would be ripping out what they have and adding a new one. MessageFormat 2.0 as it is, I think can work with the current without, radical changes. I do agree that metadata is important. So is the Xlif something where we can extend to make it fit better? And then maybe focus on JavaScript, as I don't know if they use Xlif at all in the pipeline.
In JavaScript, no, there is not in general any Xlif. But as I mentioned with Xlif, the issue is that fundamentally it's a format that's meant to be able to take messages that are in the source represented somewhere else and then represent them for translation work and allow that to be done really well. But it doesn't. But using it as the source format and extending it and adding additional complexity and power to that format it results in something that is even more complex than the current Xlif, which is not universally supported. There are challenges there.
It's
So-
a change format, not developer friendly.
I was going to suggest that you're defining something that is programming language independent. So I wouldn't look at particular programming languages like ECMA. And I think in order to be accepted, Well, first of all, I wouldn't worry about who's going to adopt it until it exists and we have some experience with it. But rather than CLDR, I would suggest maybe if ICU were to use it, and because not only with ICU you get access to the files, but you need some tooling around it so that authors and translators can work with it. So you want to give it an environment where it can get built up. And I'm not sure that W3C or IETF would get, you can get the standard published, but I'm not sure how much work would be then done using it. Whereas if it's in ICU, then it naturally gets some support. So I would suggest that if the ICU teams were interested.
So one clarification here. When I say ECMA, I don't mean ECMA PC39, which is the entity defining JavaScript and ECMAScript, but as a potentially new TC under ECMA for this work, because I agree it is not specific to JavaScript.
So I wanted to give a few notes as someone currently studying translation and working on that end of it, which is that I don't think additional metadata will help us unless it can be presented as the context it represents. Metadata, tags are fundamentally designed to represent the context that is the final format, the final document, the final app. And what translators want, in my experience as a translator, is to be able to see that context and not just the abstract representation of it. I find it easier to translate things like a Word document as just a Word document, to type and replace text, because I can see what it's supposed to look like. And I know that obviously that's not how it works for everything. I know that apps don't work that way. I am a programmer. But as a translator, what I want is to be able to see what I'm doing in a non-abstract sense. And maybe a new resource format will help that. Maybe it won't. But I think what you would want to focus on more is end user software, in the translator case, that lets you see what you're doing.
Mihai? I did just want to double check if there's anyone else in the room who has questions here, because I know that Mihai, Addison, and Eemeli talked amongst each other a lot. So like, it's probably more valuable to spend the last few minutes to get feedback from other people in the room as well.
Okay.
But if there's not Mihai, you can go ahead.
I'll try quick. Maybe one idea would be to add something that is standard, that is missing in a lot of places, which is the metadata. As is, what about we split the metadata idea from the new file format idea? Because you have ways to glue this kind of metadata on Java properties and JSON and all that, right? So maybe we might be an idea to split that in two. And then Android XMLs, they are not forced to drop their format, but they can benefit from a standard way to have the same metadata everywhere.
Defining the metadata schema and defining defining the data model for resources can entirely be beneficial outside of anything specifically for message resources. But yeah,
There is a beginning with ITS, but it's XML specific.
Yeah, sorry for just grabbing the mic back. I wanted to say that one thing I didn't mention is, of course, translators work with so many kinds of files. Word documents, Photoshop, InDesign. We work with so many different kinds of files. And I think that something like he was describing, like a metadata schema and not necessarily a new format, would be probably preferable, because it allows all these different file formats, proprietary and otherwise, to adopt better metadata descriptions. And I think that would be more helpful in the long run. But that's just my perspective.
Okay, Addison, this will be the last question.
I think maybe two quick observations. One is you mentioned data model here. You also mentioned the MF2 data model, which I didn't highlight so dramatically. Having a resource data model will help pivot existing formats more successfully. A challenge is that many of the formats we have today just don't have tooling attached to them. I'm going to slightly disagree that I think in most, at least large company translation areas, translators are not working with file formats. They're working with things that have been digested in some local dialect of XLIF, and they are working on highly highly processed, but also they're the cheapest fastest thing. Yeah, and so I'm blocking on the word, but it's like we're not feeding them good stuff, in part because there's a bazillion formats and all of those just fall on the floor. And so they're just basically seeing strings with protected garbage. And so we get the least result from that.
That's true of software,
Yes, but what we want to do is, I think, get to an ecosystem where tooling will be profitable to invest in, so that we all get a benefit from it, and that requires more ecosystem than reinventing it. I did this at Amazon with a single file format, and the file format was way more successful than the formatter, but the formatter was hidden behind it. And so that's message format 2 is a first step, but I think message resource is ultimately more important, and developers being willing to write it, and then tooling being able to deal with it. Those are the key pieces. Otherwise, we just have strings.
Okay, let's give a round of applause for Eemeli. And I think we have a break right now.